Hello everyone, I'm Ian Walmsley. I'm the Provost here at Imperial, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the 2021 Grantham Annual Lecture. The annual lecture is one of Grantham's most prestigious events of the year, and this year we welcome over 800 of you from across the world. Tackling the climate crisis and helping our society move towards a sustainable future is, of course, one of the most vital and urgent challenges of our time. And at Imperial, we intend to make significant contributions towards meeting that challenge. Our mission is, of course, to deliver excellence in research, education, and innovation, with impact deriving from new knowledge to enable major issues such as this to be addressed. We do that both through impact derived from our research, as well as training the next generation of thinkers, leaders, and decision makers. Sustainability and environment are at the heart of our mission. We've recently made a number of important changes and steps in this area. When we launched the academic strategy in 2020, our mission was focused around 4 areas: creating a healthy society, sustainable society, a smart society, and a resilient society. And this strategy has enabled the launch of several transformational cross-disciplinary programs in research, education, and innovation, including the Transition to Zero Pollution, the Institute of Infection, Digital Molecular Design, and our new Digital and Data Science Initiative, IX. We've introduced a new socially responsible investment policy to make sure our investment decisions take into account the same sort of social, environmental, and governance concerns. And we're working to embed a process by which we monitor and assess how the college is making progress in influencing fossil fuel companies through its engagement with them. In early this year, we launched Imperial's first sustainability strategy that sets out the college's long-term goal to be a sustainable and net zero carbon institution by 2040. Multidisciplinary work is essential to this endeavour, and the Grantham Institute is our leading hub for efforts relating to climate change and environmental activities. The Institute helps connect and harness across our academic community various capabilities. It helps support collaboration and new research, as well as application and policy informing. We hope through this mechanism and aligning our great strengths across the institution to lead effective action on climate change and the environment. This year, it was fantastic to see Grantham and the Royal Institution launch the Centre for Climate Change Innovation in London. And this will help catalyse innovation that addresses some of the issues around causes and effects of climate change, and bringing together businesses, entrepreneurs, policymakers, together with academics and the public to really embed change and drive it forward through new companies. So these are a few of the activities that are already underway at the college to address climate change and sustainability, but of course there's very much more to do. And as part of our 10-year future vision, we have a strand that is dedicated to coordinating and raising the ambition of our sustainability and environmental research, teaching and innovation, building upon the great work that's been led by Grantham and is embedded across multiple departments, faculties and institutes. So I now would like to hand over to Professor Maggie Dalman, our Vice President International and Associate Provost for Academic Partnerships, as well as a Professor of Immunology. She wears many hats, to introduce our esteemed speaker for this lecture. Over to you, Maggie.
Ian, thank you very much for that introduction. I've got a couple of housekeeping things that I need to mention. Because today's event is being recorded, the question and answer portion of the event will actually provide an opportunity for questions. Many of you I know have submitted questions already, but you can still submit questions via the question and answer function on the right-hand side of your screen. If you don't wish your name to appear, against the question, then just hit the anonymous button. And if there are any questions that are similar to yours already on the chat, perhaps you can just like those so that we see that there's interest rather than writing a whole new version of the question. So I think, we have a fantastically topical and important subject to discuss today, the intersection of COVID and climate change and how we can learn from one to help the other. And it's shocking and terrible to say, but multiple concurrent and interrelated crises are now a way of life at only 1.2 degrees of warming relative to pre-industrial levels. However, the pandemic, although it's been very traumatic, is teaching us how to respond to a global threat, and we can apply this learning to fight, we hope, against climate change. Taking advantage of some of the responses to coronavirus, such as less unnecessary air travel and more home working, could be powerful short-term actions worth embedding for the longer-term fight against climate change. The central importance of behaviour change is also now recognised, but it's important to acknowledge that such change can only occur when human life and survival is considered more important than business as usual GDP growth. This year, across the globe, extreme weather events have had a devastating and often deadly results. Scientists have long warned that climate change would contribute to an increase in both the frequency and severity of freak weather. Previously, the threats posed by climate change have been regarded as a problem for the developing world, but in recent months, developed countries have felt the most severe effects of extreme weather. And there are many examples, including, from record-breaking snowfall in Madrid to a heat dome in the Pacific Northwest. The pandemic and climate change have also have in common that their impact is most keenly felt by the most vulnerable people in society. Social distancing measures and their effect on the economy have most impact on individuals with low or irregular income, or those with poor health. And this leads us to conclude that the sooner we deal with climate change, the greater the benefits will be for all, and the lower the cost to society. Today, inequities and climate injustice have become integral to climate negotiations. In the Kyoto Protocol and then the Paris Agreement, world leaders agreed to establish the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. However, countries that are least responsible for climate change are often the ones suffering most from its effects. Moreover, as highlighted in the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, one of the primary threats to human life as a result of climate change is food insecurity, especially in the global south, where people rely on small-scale agriculture and are more vulnerable to droughts, flooding and extreme weather. During the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen how connected we all are, and importantly, how we can work together and mobilise resources together when needed. And we have a continuing opportunity to work together as a global community to rebuild more sustainable and resilient economies and lives. COP26 is on the horizon. This decade is our chance to keep the 1.50 temperature limit within reach. At a time when climate negotiations are set to place the net zero transition at the heart of economic plans globally, a vision for global justice as an essential part of the solution to the climate crisis, and a fairer future for all has never been more important. Given the need for international cooperation in climate change and climate action and a global strategy, and to recognise the huge impact global movements for justice, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, have had recently on climate conversations, we bring to you today views on vulnerability and climate action for the survival of our cultures in a post-COVID world. And it is my very great pleasure to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker for today, Rueanna Haynes. Thank you, Rueanna, and welcome to Imperial College. Rueanna is an international climate law and governance specialist and director for the not-for-profit think tank Climate Analytics Caribbean. She is senior advisor for the High Ambition Coalition on Climate Change. A former Trinidad and Tobago diplomat, Rueanna has participated in the UN climate negotiations for just over a decade. And during that time, she's been a lead negotiator for the Caribbean community, as well as the Alliance of Small Island States. She has significant experience in other international negotiation processes of key importance to small island developing states. These include sustainable development, financing for development, and the Convention on the Law of the Sea. Rueanna holds a Master's in International Legal Studies from Georgetown University Law Center, Washington, D.C., and a Master's in International Affairs Environmental Policy from Sciences Po in Paris. Rueanna Haynes will examine what climate action means in the current circumstances, how priorities, especially those of the vulnerable, will evolve to cope with a radically changing and increasingly hostile natural and economic environment, as well as the entry points for meaningful solidarity from the global community at this time. Rueanna, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Maggie. It's definitely a pleasure to be with you all today, to be giving this lecture. I'll just start right away. I only have 20 minutes and I'm hoping very much that I can keep to time. And so, as you would have heard, the topic I'm discussing today is Weathering the Climate Crisis and COVID-19, a perspective from the epicenter of the perfect storm. I know that sounds a little dramatic, but I will be making the case as to why I've chosen to present in this manner. So my outline will be as follows. I'll be presenting across about 9 topics, speaking specifically from the perspective of small island developing states. And so the first issue I'm going to address is who exactly are small island developing states, or SIDS, to put that into context, moving on to the ongoing effects of the climate crisis, the impact of COVID-19 on SIDS, the SIDS response to the crisis, the global response to SIDS COVID-related challenges, proposed solutions for SIDS indebtedness, lessons learned, the importance of COP26, and challenges for SIDS at COP26. After which I'll give a few concluding remarks before we move into the question and answer session. So my first slide, who exactly are SIDS? I think I need to preface this by saying that there is no real agreed definition for what constitutes a small island developing state. In fact, a Google search of SIDS will probably bring up quite a few different constellations of countries. I'm going to present here the constellation of small island developing states that is set out by the UN system, by the UN Office of the High Representative for Landlocked, Least Developed Countries and Small Island Developing States, the UN OHRLLS. And they have counted 58 small island developing states. Now, I think this is the most expansive definition of SIDS that we have. It's about 65 million people, so less than 1% of the global population. And this group, as you would see by looking at the membership, is extraordinarily diverse. It's a very heterogeneous group. However, there are some unique socioeconomic and environmental challenges that they all share, at least to some extent or the other. Some of these are as follows. SIDS are known for their small size, even though I will caveat that by saying that there's no accepted definition of smallness. For SIDS, their relative remoteness from major global markets, high vulnerability to climate change impacts, also high vulnerability to external economic shocks, high biodiversity in very small areas, but a very vulnerable biodiversity that's subject to biodiversity loss, again, usually as a result of climate change impacts, a narrow resource base, and low economies of scale or an inability to take advantage of economies of scale. One of the key defining characteristics of SIDS, the vast majority of SIDS, is the fact that they're also known as among the most indebted developing countries in the world. And I want to focus in on this notion of SIDS indebtedness, which sort of exists in a vicious cycle around some of the key characteristics of SIDS, especially as it relates to their inability to take advantage of economies of scale, but also high vulnerability to climate change impacts and external shocks that drives some of the fiscal decision making in SIDS that leads to this high level of indebtedness, creating to some extent the perfect storm between COVID-19 as well as climate change. And so some of the ongoing effects of the climate crisis in SIDS, we have a photo here of the capital of Dominica that was completely destroyed by Hurricane Maria in 2017. Dominica lost 225% of their GDP. That is what the losses amounted to as a result of this Category 5 storm. This is not an uncommon statistic, unfortunately, for small island developing states when faced with superstorms that are growing increasingly intense as a result of climate change. We have sea level rise leading to loss of low-lying islands, particularly in the Pacific, but also in the Caribbean, as well as severe erosion, tropical cyclones, marine heat waves, higher air temperatures, changes in rainfall patterns. And this is really ramping up in these years. As we've heard, we are now at a 1.2 degrees Celsius temperature increase. And I can tell you from actual personal experience that the changes in rainfall patterns are wreaking almost as much havoc in many island countries as major storms. Decreased water quality, drought, and declines in fisheries that form important parts of the economies of several small island developing states. So what is the impact of COVID-19 in this context? We have a very, very bleak outlook. An overall decline in GDP growth. The statistics say it's something around a loss of 9% of GDP for some cities, as opposed to an average of 3.3% in other developing countries. Shrinking fiscal space, again, because of borrowing to beef up healthcare systems, borrowing to secure and pay for vaccines. Unemployment in tourism-dependent sectors, and tourism and services are some of the largest sectors across many small island developing states. As a result of this unemployment, the creation actually of newly vulnerable groups of people who find themselves unemployed, who find themselves basically on the breadline as a result of COVID-19 and the lockdowns and the various mitigation measures that are being taken to deal with the health crisis, expanding sovereign debt, and emerging public health crises. We have a situation in Jamaica where at this stage, because of the high level of hospitalizations on account of COVID-19, other parts of the healthcare system are shutting down. And so the outlook is extremely bleak. In the midst of this, we see ongoing other multiple and related crises. I believe Maggie mentioned some of them. We can recall that at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic took off, there was Hurricane Harold that affected Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and other countries in the Pacific. There was a measles outbreak at the same time in Samoa. A volcano erupted in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Haiti was hit by an earthquake as well as a storm, all during the pandemic period. And so what have been some of the responses from SIDS to all of what has been taking place, in particular in relation to COVID-19? There have been economic stimulus packages targeting specific sectors of the economy, in particular tourism-based, service-based sectors, but also the entertainment sectors in some countries that have been hit equally as hard. There have been exemptions given for small and medium-sized businesses. Unemployment benefits made available, cash transfers, social assistance for households as well as students, as well as, interestingly enough, a step up in climate action, which has happened maybe not as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, but certainly simultaneously. Heading into the crisis, in 2019, before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, SIDS, many SIDS countries were already in the process of preparing new nationally determined contributions to submit to the UNFCCC. They had already made serious commitments along the lines of partnerships for changing for energy sector transformation, etc. And what we saw was, even though there was a bit of a dip in some of this work, it has continued apace in spite of the ongoing pandemic. Many SIDS governments have seen opportunities in continuing climate action, even in the midst of the COVID crisis. What has been the global response? And so I'm focusing in here a bit on the response coming from multilateral development banks specifically. There have been a number of facilities that have been made available along the lines of rapid credit, rapid financing, some debt relief for particular countries from the IMF, concessional and grant resources coming from the Asian Development Bank, financing programs and short-term liquidity guarantees, foreign trade financing and guarantees, and loan restructuring coming from the IDB. The question though, the overwhelming question though, is whether these responses have been sufficient, both in their scale as well as in their targeting. Many of them only target particular constellations of SIDS, because going back to the first slide, we have quite a heterogeneous group of SIDS and no accepted definition. And so this creates a situation where, in particular as it relates to accessing financing from the international system, different organizations use wildly different definitions and constellations of SIDS. And so they have a lot of choice in who they target for the relief measures that they make available, which I'm sure you can imagine may not be the most helpful approach. Some of the proposed solutions for the indebtedness of SIDS. And this is coming from the OECD on the one hand, the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean on the other. So an expansion in debt for climate change or debt for sustainability goals swaps, which could include the creation of a resilience fund, greater support for SIDS to access climate financing, a change in international financial institutions' eligibility criteria for actually granting concessional financing, capacity building support to SIDS for debt profile restructuring, coordinated support from the international community, and tax reform in SIDS. Now, this is a bit of a random list of some of the ideas that have been put forward for helping SIDS countries to deal with this issue of indebtedness, this issue of wildly escalating sovereign debt in the midst of also having to address other crises that are related. What I would want to highlight here is that two of these focus on climate change related solutions. And so I think this is telling us something. So I'm going to highlight two lessons learned from the experience of the COVID-19 crisis that I think can be quite applicable in the context of the discussion of the climate crisis. The first is that coordinated efforts by the international community work best to resolve a crisis. What we have seen, and I'll give the example of the vaccine rollout, what we have seen is two different approaches. An attempt at coordination through the WHO, through the COVAX facility, which, although did suffer some setbacks and delays, did provide a source of vaccines to developing countries, to vulnerable countries, at a time when vaccines were simply unavailable and being hoarded by the developed world, to be frank. And so this turned out to be, quite a stable and reliable source of vaccines for vulnerable countries at a time when they would not have been available otherwise. On the other hand, if we think about, for example, again, using the vaccine rollout, if we think about the way in which government messaging has been done around the different vaccines, their efficacy, some of the messaging around their development, the fact that many of the vaccines that were available via COVAX was then deemed to be inappropriate by the UK, by the US, by Canada, who was saying Sinopharm, for example, if you are vaccinated with Sinopharm, you are not considered vaccinated. If you're vaccinated with AstraZeneca that was produced in India, you're not considered vaccinated. This type of messaging that actually had the effect of driving vaccine hesitancy in many developing countries, this type of complete and utter lack of coordination was really highly ineffective and continues to be so in the context of the COVID crisis. The second lesson learned is around this idea that action on climate change can catalyze the achievement of development goals and build resilience for dealing with multiple and interrelated crises. I think when we consider the fact that the debt swap, the debt for climate swap, the debt for sustainability goals debt swap, that it is possible that this type of response can help vulnerable countries respond to a crisis, multiple crises at the same time. We see that climate action really has the power to drive resilience that can benefit states in other areas. If we look at the messaging coming from the President of the United States at present around the idea that his climate change response will be focused on jobs, we see that it is very possible to link up climate action with core development aims and objectives that can benefit the whole of society. And I just really need to raise an anecdote here around a situation that we had when we were agreeing the summary for policymakers for the special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, where there was a lot of discussion around a figure that attempted to show the relationship between a 1.5 degree consistent pathway and the Sustainable Development Goals. And there was a lot of speculation around whether there would be more trade-offs than actual synergies. I think now, living through COVID-19 in a time of climate change, we see that we err on the side of there actually being more synergies than trade-offs in this approach. So what of COP26? COP26 is undoubtedly, from where I sit, the most important COP since COP21 in Paris. Hopefully, we can do three things. We can complete the architecture of the Paris Agreement. There are some outstanding issues that need to be addressed. We can actually respond to the science, which is the clearest it has ever been on what is happening, why it is happening, and how we can actually help to update it. And we absolutely need to demonstrate solidarity with vulnerable countries and what they are facing at this time. And so SIDS are facing some specific challenges at COP26. First and foremost, around participation, in particular for Pacific SIDS. It is proving to be an intractable issue, considering how they can actually get to the COP and back, considering the amount of restrictions that are in place around travel to and from the Pacific. We're facing a situation where there continues to be low ambition from members of the G7 and the G20. AOSIS had called for a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature limit in 2008, 13 years ago. In 2021, the G7 is finally on board with this, and they've all agreed in their last statement that they will move towards 2050 net zero strategies as a result. But
Yes, well, I think we have lost Rueanna at the moment, but I hope we will get her back in a minute. Let me take this opportunity to just confirm that we have questions submitted before the talk, but please do put any questions you have in your using the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you don't wish your name to appear in the recording, please select Post as Anonymous. And if there are any questions similar to yours, then please give these a like rather than submitting the same question. That would make it much easier for us. So I think Rueanna's gone out of the electronic media, and I hope she's going to manage to make it back in a minute. It's always one of the difficulties of this sort of remote talk that we have here, and it's the nightmare that it happens in the middle of the speaker's talk. But I'm hoping that we will get her back any minute. Perhaps I can also say that there will be a recording of this event, I hope with the pause taken out, and it will be on an Imperial YouTube channel and the Grantham Institute's YouTube channel as well. And there'll be a follow-up email that will link with this, and also will give you a link to this, and it will give you various other bits of information that we hope will be helpful. But I think Rueanna's waiting to be admitted again, so I hope we have her back now. So Rueanna, are you back with us?
I'm back. I'm very sorry about that. I think my internet fell out, and ironically enough, it fell out just as I was talking about connectivity issues. This is what happens. I will wrap up quickly to keep us to time. Let me just reshare my presentation. My apologies.
Please do take your time.
Okay, great. I trust you can still see and hear me. Yes. Okay, so I was just moving to, I believe I was just moving to this slide when the internet dropped. So I was asking the question of what do SIDS really need from COP26? First and foremost, we need 4 countries to be coming forward with new 1.5 degrees Celsius aligned NDCs. This, in order to close the mitigation ambition gap, the G20 alone could make a real difference, accounting for about 85% of total global emissions. In the context of this question around solidarity with the vulnerable, this question around building resilience to deal with, as Maggie set out, this world where multiple and interrelated crises are now a way of life, we desperately need for there to be a scale up in adaptation finance. The UN Secretary General has called for an even split between mitigation and adaptation coming out of climate finance, so 50% allocation. I believe at this stage there's only about 26% or less, depending on how you count it, of climate financing that's going towards adaptation. In this context, there's the $100 billion promise that came out of Copenhagen, Cancun in 2009-2010. That has now been extended out to 2025. There can be no real resilience building or climate action on the ground without climate financing being made available. And so this promise needs to be met, again, in line with this idea around solidarity. We also need to commit to a clear process for the elaboration of a new long-term climate finance goal that actually responds to the needs of the vulnerable, and it's not just pulled out of the sky like the 100 billion figure was back in 2009. And so some brief conclusions. Essentially, SIDS are in the middle of a perfect storm between the climate crisis and the COVID-19 crisis, because they face, in addition to these, and because of these, a looming debt crisis. Now, this debt situation would have predated COVID-19 and would have been a part of a very, very vicious cycle between SIDS being hit by increasingly intense climate-related weather events, and then having to borrow their way out of that for rebuilding, especially since many of them cannot access concessional finance. And then in the midst of that, now also having to deal with the pandemic and making funding available in order to deal with mitigating the impacts of the pandemic. Climate change impacts are also ramping up and threaten to sink SIDS further into debt as temperatures continue to increase. And we know for a fact, based on the special report of 1.5 degrees Celsius, that even if we are successful at limiting warming to that degree, it will still imply major climate impacts, very dangerous climate impacts. It will still lead to severe loss and damage in SIDS, but as well as in other countries around the world. The global response to COVID-19 holds many lessons and opportunities for SIDS to increase resilience and for the international community to support SIDS efforts. Again, this support needs to be coordinated as well as hold climate and sustainability goals at its heart. COP26 is a critical point of departure for SIDS' continued viability and survival into the future. So I will leave it there and hand the floor over now, I believe, to Brian. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Rueanna, very much. And I'm sorry you were interrupted in the middle, but and during that spell, I did actually manage to remind everyone that we do have questions already submitted, but please put some more in the Q&A and say if you want them to be anonymous, and also like another one if it's a similar question rather than put an extra one for yourself. So we will now get into the question time, and we do have a number of questions around. Perhaps let me start with one about this thing of resilience versus climate change and mitigating that. Is resilience now as important as net zero carbon 2050? And there's a rider on this. Should small island tourism centric states urgently pursue climate friendly travel? So a slightly different question. So it is this balance between resilience and net zero carbon. And then there's a little rider about climate friendly travel in order to reach your countries.
Yeah, so I would say that resilience is definitely now as important as net zero targets. In my last point, I was alluding to the fact that even if we manage to limit the increase in average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will still all be faced with very, very dangerous impacts of climate change. And so at this stage, where there are countries that can already barely cope with what is happening now, it is imperative that we do two things at once. We haven't even been very good at doing one thing at a time, but unfortunately, my assessment would be that we need to be doing both at once, setting the net zero targets as well as making a very, very strong and enhanced effort on helping countries to become more resilient. And I think, not to put too much of a fine point on it, but this is particularly important because we will be dealing with multiple and interrelated crises, and we have to find ways to draw a line that will help us to address all of them, hopefully at once. And focusing on resilience is really going to be the only way to do that. In relation to the question on travel, I would say that, well, in the first instance, I don't know of any small island developing state that has the the economic or other power to dictate this issue of sustainable travel, or to put in those to influence the market in that way. Normally, when it comes to the cost of travel to our islands, we do not have the control over those costs. It's usually not our airlines, and we are not the influence on the market in that regard. So I would probably leave that there.
That's fine. Yes, I should have said that question was from Anna Baranova, SOAS, and I got one on the chat here, which is anonymous. How can we get decision makers to view climate change as the crisis it is, to mimic the response to COVID-19? The public seem to be becoming more aware of its crisis status, but little change is being made by Western governments, where these governments won't see climate change as a crisis until it is their own homes that are flooded or burnt down by wildfire. It's not even clear, if I can add, that when that happens, they take it seriously enough either. But what's your take on this?
I think a part of the reason why the government response seems to lag behind public awareness is because government systems are by their very nature slow. But also because they must respond to different stimulus. And so there is a cry of the public, but then we cannot ignore the role of the private sector and the fact that government must also respond to their needs. So I would say, in terms of getting governments to move in step with reality and with what we are all seeing is happening, as citizens, as the buying public, we also need to start putting pressure on the private sector so that they can in turn also put pressure on the government, or so that they can understand that their bottom line is going to be affected by the positions that they continue to take on these issues.
Okay. Then there was a question, I think I wrongly said Anna Baranova was the other one, but this one is about communication, which maybe follows from this. What lessons can we learn from the way communications have been done during COVID-19 that can be applied to improve climate change communications in terms of greater policy acceptance and behaviour change? Do you think there are any lessons in communication?
I think if we are learning lessons in communication from COVID-19 response, we're learning the lessons of what not to do. We're learning the lessons of what not to do. There are some key lessons around, wanting to, first of all, wanting to reassure the citizenry about what is happening in advance of, because of political reasons, in advance of what the science is actually saying, or counter to what the science is actually saying. So many governments took the position of assuring citizens around, we will be able to return to normal. Once you get your vaccine, mask mandates will no longer be relevant. But what the science was actually saying is that vaccines are important, please get your vaccines, but masks will continue to be required. Masks will continue to be required because COVID-19 and its variants is going nowhere. So I think in terms of communications, what we are learning, the biggest lesson to me would be that there needs to be, I guess, more willingness at the political level to stay in line with what the science is saying and not run ahead of the science for political reasons.
Okay, thank you. Then Navin Rueanna from Premier says, what is the role of financial institutions and are they doing enough?
Are they doing enough? I would say they are not doing enough. And I would also say that their role is critical. Financial institutions really have at their fingertips, I guess, the resources that could affect real economy change in terms of how we deal with the climate crisis. We understand that we need actually to shift global investment in the trillions towards climate action in order to have a chance of being able to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And banking institutions play a major role there and need to become more coordinated in their responses in this regard. Okay,
perhaps I can turn to the thing of just how much debt there is around. You really highlighted the debt problem, and then the international community has promised this 100 billion, and it seems to be pretty elusive. The whole idea of adaptation finance, it seems really a very difficult situation, yet you seemed a little bit more positive than that would suggest.
It is a very difficult situation. I would say, as one of my colleagues always says, positivity is now an occupational hazard for me. There's really no other way to operate in this climate change process other than looking on the brighter side of life, searching for that silver lining. I would say that, yes, the situation is indeed extremely dire. The 100 billion is elusive, and the 100 billion is a drop in the bucket. So a drop in the bucket, and it's also elusive. And, you know, there's also a lot of hesitancy amongst the donors in terms of actually making it available. But the silver lining is that, well, I guess in one context, we know that the vast amounts of climate financing will not come from the public purse. And there is an opportunity to try to shift these trillions that seem to be available privately, that is not yet fully being capitalized on, that needs to be capitalized on. And there's still, I guess, the possibility that that could happen.
Good. A rather different question from Paul Julian. What does surviving the climate crisis mean in terms of the built visual stroke architectural landscape? How can we look at planning for the future now in terms of funding not only resilience to, but new and adapted public and private housing, factory buildings, bridges and city structures, etc. So looking forward, what does it mean in terms of our built landscape?
It means our built landscape would definitely need to be transformed, which I guess is the tenor of the question. And this, you know, this needs to happen across the board in the developing world. You know, there has been a strong push for our built landscape to evolve, to adapt to climate impacts. Of course, there's going to be limits to the extent to which that can be done, but there's still a lot of work to be done to bring building codes up to standard in many countries. In other parts of the world, it means that more efficient ways of building have to be found so that there is, you know, less energy spent on heating, less energy spent on cooling at different times of the year. And I know that there is a lot of work underway on that already, but it does not seem to be taking place at scale. And it needs to vastly expand from now into the future.
Have a couple of questions on population. One question, Keith Woodward said, why is controlling population growth never proposed as one of the solutions to controlling our carbon emissions? And then Leslie Jane Powell actually says, world population seems to have peaked. What effect will this have on developed nations and others for their economies? Do you want to just talk a little bit population?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this question around population control before. I would say that, you know, population control helping us to limit emissions, helping us to limit whose emissions. When we think about where emissions are coming from primarily, where they have come from historically, and how we got to this point, instituting population controls now on countries that are in the process of developing seems a bit inequitable and arbitrary, and also insufficient as a response to the climate crisis, because evidently energy system transformation is what will make the key difference and is what is actually required. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer to put it out there that if we simply institute population control on large emerging developing countries and we continue business as usual everywhere else, we will solve the climate crisis. So that would be my response to that. In terms of the question of peaking, I'm not sure. It seems as if, you know, there are possibilities around migration and resource reallocation, but this is a very ticklish issue and one that always raises eyebrows in the context of the climate discussion, but it's one that we will have to tackle in the very near future.
Perhaps we can turn to a question on COP26. Laura asked, do you consider that the developing countries, most of them in the red list in the UK, will be affected in the negotiations of COP26? What action should be taken to mitigate negative effects with these countries?
Yeah, so the UK's arbitrary red list is going to affect a number of developing countries traveling to the COP. The presidency has assured that for developing countries on the red list who will have to quarantine for 5 days ahead of the start of the COP, that this will be paid for by the UK government. And so this is the mitigation measure that has been put in place, but it still doesn't make it any more convenient, especially since it's really not clear the criteria around which countries have been allocated to different lists. The list appears to be evolving to some extent, but not in ways that are actually transparent, is what I would say. So, you know, we hope that the mitigation measure that they will be paying for actual quarantine 5 days ahead of the COP will be useful, but of course it means that countries that would normally already bear the burden of having to leave their families and travel to the COP ahead of time anyway, now will be doubly faced with bearing that burden. So,
yeah. So keeping on the COP, we've talked a little about the $100 billion but there's loss and damage has been one of the really contentious issues in the climate negotiations. And as then we get more and more excessive weather giving problems in the developing countries and in SIDS in particular. And then clearly, as you've highlighted, the debt crisis there and more help is going to be needed. Again, are you fairly confident that this is going to be a discussion? Perhaps I asked this before, but it does seem a crucial problem about where we're going to get a bit of a breakthrough here in the COP.
Yeah, it's not clear. I would say that most of the outcomes that I would have outlined that SIDS actually need from the COP, it's really not clear the direction that we will be heading in or whether any big breakthroughs will be possible. In that context, a breakthrough on loss and damage seems to be the most distant in that regard. The question of loss and damage has sort of recently come up as possibly being part of the outcome at this COP, at least from the side of the presidency. But it's not yet clear whether there's anything substantial on the table to deliver in that regard, or whether there's any willingness to do so. And so I think that while there have been a number of side discussions ongoing in relation to finance, access to finance, technical discussions on how to actually allow for SIDS to be able to remove the barriers that prevent them from accessing finance, etc. Those have been happening on the side. It's also not clear how they will be taken up in the context of a COP outcome. And on the question of loss and damage financing itself, there's been very, very, very little discussion. There isn't even an agenda item on loss and damage for the COP. To be frank, that's where we're starting from. There's no agenda item. And so it's going to require quite a heavy lift. But I will say we have been in situations before heading into various COPs where issues that no one thought would see the light of day at a COP emerged as breakthrough issues due to shifts in the politics that happened at the very last minute. So there's always hope.
Perhaps I see we're reaching the time where I better ask the final question. Do you remain optimistic? We've seen all the difficulties, there's all the debt, there's all the crises occurring, and the developed countries are not coming up with their NDCs in general, certainly the very big ones that are anyway commensurate with the 1.5. Yet you seem like a positive person. How can we all be positive? Can you help us all be positive?
There's always a reason. There's always a reason for positivity. There are usually silver linings involved. No, I don't want to make light of the situation at all. It is extremely bleak. As we speak, even in my own country, there has been unprecedented flooding as a result of extreme rainfall, which actually, is on some level as disheartening as being hit with a major storm, because it's every day you get up and there's flooding. It's compounded damage. It's, it really affects your outlook. It dampens your spirit. And so the outlook itself is an extremely challenging one. However, I do remain optimistic that there can be a breakthrough in some of these areas for COP26. What it will require would be a continued push from vulnerable countries, which will assuredly come, not just from SIDS, also from least developed countries, as well as solidarity from allies, in particular in the EU, with the United States and others. And this remains possible. So I will leave it there.
Right. Well, apologies to those people whose questions we haven't managed to get through, but you've given superb answers to those questions, and your talk as well has really taken us into the whole issue of climate change involved with all the other crises and the debts, and what it really means in small island states as well as in the whole global community. Thank you so much for that talk, Rueanna. It's just really good, and your answers to the questions. And it really takes us to the COP26. Just thinking about that, the realities of COP26, and all of us redoubling our efforts to try and make sure it's a success, anything we can do. So thank you, Rueanna, for that. And thank you to the audience for being here and for your questions and for just being an active part of this as much as you can be. We all wish we could have done it together, but we've done it together this way anyway. So a recording of this event will be posted on the Imperial YouTube channel and on the Grantham Institute channel. And you'll receive a follow-up email which will give you a link to those as well as other relevant reading. And we hope you'll sign up to the Grantham newsletter, which will keep you on board with everything that's going on. So thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye. Thank you for being here.